Hello, good evening, and welcome to Project Poseidon's Channel Aquarius. I'm your host, Dave the Dude, and this is our second broadcast. This show attempts to take a somewhat grounded and rational perspective on various topics that might be considered fringe in polite society, such as conspiracy theories, the paranormal, UFOs, psychology and spirituality, the occult, the fate of the planet, the evolution of humanity, and where possible, we try to reflect with a sense of wonder on this thing we call a universe. Where I am in Ottawa, Canada, the hour is late, the coffee's on, and the mood is mostly mellow. So, thanks for joining me. On today's show, we'll be asking questions about consciousness, the nature of reality, and whether or not we can trust our senses to show us the world as it is. Consider your receipt of this message. This message formed as an idea in my mind. I clumsily encoded it in English in my brain, then sent biological signaling to my vocal cords to cause the air to vibrate in certain patterns, which was then picked up by my microphone, translated into ones and zeros by my computer, encoded and stored on a whirling magnetic disk, later transmitted by satellite to the cloud, downloaded by the same means to your own device, which decoded the message, reconstructed it as sound waves again. The sound waves caused a biological response in your eardrum, which triggered certain associations in your brain, which then deconstructed the emergent meaning encoded in the English language for the underlying idea. We use the word reality to describe things that seem to exist. So is this idea real, then, in the same sense that your toast is real? Well, reality, as it turns out, is a pretty good mindfuck. What is it? We're not sure. Do we even know what we mean when we bust out that word, reality? Does it matter? Well, in a word, yes, it matters. Words are important. They shape our thinking. In fact, I've heard it said that 99% of all philosophical disagreements are eventually settled by agreeing on what words mean and how they should be used. Wikipedia defines reality as the conjectured state of things as they actually exist, rather than as they may appear or might be imagined. Existence is defined as the world one is aware or conscious of, which objectively persists independent of one's presence. The universe is defined as the totality of existence. Totality is defined as unconditional reality, which transcends limited conditional existence. So, it would seem that from the get-go, the words we use to talk about our environment are kind of circular and self-referential. That seems kind of limiting to me. Maybe we need different words to talk about different kinds of reality. Maybe our grip on reality would be improved by such an innovation. What do I mean by different kinds of reality? Consider a fly crawling across a compact disc on which Beethoven's masterworks are recorded. Now, the fly, or the ant if you prefer, has no experience, no possible way of appreciating in any sense the scale or the significance of what it is interacting with. It can't understand humans or their history, the Industrial Revolution, the invention of electricity, lasers, Sony Corporation, music, Beethoven, coffee tables, or any of those other things. So, can these things, the antenna on the fly's head, on the ant's head, sorry, flies don't have antenna, the brilliance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, can they be said to be real in the same way? This raises a couple of interesting questions. Does Marxism exist in the same sense that your headphones exist? I mean, it can be clumsily said that they are both things, can it not? Also, for that matter, we're told that dark matter makes up 96% of the known universe. Are we sure we're not like this fly or ant in our attempt to map out the universe? The sage Robert Anton Wilson had a good working definition of reality, I think, when he said it was, quote, the boundary where rival gangs of shamans fought to a standstill. What did he mean by that? Well, Wilson was big on what he called reality tunnels. That notion that every individual interprets the same world differently, with truth being in the eye of the beholder. The Wikipedia entry on reality tunnels says the following. It offers, the idea of a reality tunnel does not necessarily imply that there is no objective truth. Rather, that our access to it is mediated through our senses, experience, conditioning, prior beliefs, and other non-objective factors. The implied individual world each person occupies is said to be their reality tunnel. The term can also apply to groups of people united by beliefs. We can speak of the fundamentalist Christian reality tunnel, or the ontological naturalism reality tunnel. A parallel can be seen in the psychological concept of confirmation bias, the human tendency to notice and assign significance to observations that confirm existing beliefs, while filtering out or rationalizing away observations that do not fit with prior beliefs and expectations. This helps to explain why reality tunnels are usually transparent to their inhabitants. While it seems most people take their beliefs to correspond to the one true objective reality, Robert Anton Wilson emphasizes that each person's reality tunnel is their own artistic creation, whether they realize it or not. Now, don't know if you've heard of Gödel and his incompleteness theorems, which state that every non-trivial formal system is either incomplete or inconsistent. Now, he was describing mathematics, but if mathematics is the language of physics, and physics is our description of the universe, Gödel's incompleteness theorems would seem to imply that, it's been mathematically proven that our attempts to map the territory in its totality are always going to meet with failure. In other words, we can never, mathematically, we can just never figure out everything there is to figure out. There's always going to be more. Albert Einstein was quoted as saying, "Nature shows us only the tail of the lion, but there is no doubt in my mind that the lion belongs with it, even if he cannot reveal himself to the eye all at once because of his huge dimension. We see him only the way a louse sitting upon him would." So, now if we imagine that our knowledge of the universe and its workings is comparable to a glass of water, would we imagine that glass to be 90% full? 10% full? 1% full? Just how much of the puzzle have we figured out? Just how adequate are our senses to perceiving reality? That question brings me to the first article I wanted to share with you this evening. Taken from Scientific American, the title of the article is Did humans evolve to see things as they really are? It reads as follows. One of the deepest problems in epistemology is how we know the nature of reality. Over the millennia, philosophers have offered many theories, from solipsism, only one's mind is known to exist, to the theory that natural selection shaped our senses to give us accurate or veridical or model of the world. Now a new theory by University of California Irvine cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman is garnering attention. We can Google his scholarly papers and TED Talk with more than 1.4 million views. Grounded in evolutionary psychology, it is called the interface theory of perception, ITP, and argues that percepts act as a species-specific user interface that directs behavior towards survival and reproduction, not truth. Hoffman's computer analogy is that physical space is like the desktop, and that objects in it are like desktop icons, which are produced by the graphical user interface, or GUI. Our senses, he says, form a biological user interface, a GUI, between our brain and the outside world, transducing physical stimuli such as photons of light into neural impulses processed by the visual cortex as things in the environment. GUIs are useful because you don't need to know what is inside computers and brains, you just need to know how to interact with that interface well enough to accomplish your task. Adaptive function, not veridical perception, is what is important. Hoffman's holotype is the Australian jewel beetle Julodimorpha beckwelli. Females are large, shiny brown, and dimpled. So too are discarded beer bottles, dubbed stubbies. And males will mount them until they die by heat, starvation, or ants. The species was on the brink of extinction because its senses and brain were designed by natural selection not to perceive reality, but to mate with anything big, brown, shiny, and dimply. To test his theory, Hoffman ran thousands of evolutionary computer simulations, in which digital organisms whose perceptual systems are tuned exclusively for truth are outcompeted by those tuned solely for fitness. Because natural selection depends only on expected fitness, evolution shaped our sensory systems towards fitter behavior, not truthful representation. The author of the article goes on to express his doubts about Hoffman's theory, but I feel he buried the lead a bit. I want to return to talk about Hoffman in a few moments, because I feel his potential contribution to human understanding goes so far beyond what is covered in this article. The author of the article concludes on this note. He says, "Finally, why present this problem as an either-or choice between fitness and truth? Adaptations depend in large part on a relatively accurate model of reality. The fact that science progresses towards, say, eradicating diseases and landing spacecraft on Mars must mean that our perceptions of reality are growing ever closer to the truth, even if it is with a small t." Okay, I think that's an important point. If your epistemology or theory of truth is such that you see truth as a process or a journey, something to be striven for but never finally arrived at, you're very much more likely, I would think, to enjoy productive conversations with other people. The zealots are the ones who think they've got truth figured out. As Robert Anton Wilson said, when dogma enters the brain, all intellectual activity ceases. Here's another thought. The movie The Matrix popularized the standpoint of perception psychology, which basically seeks to focus attention on the fact that everything that is real to us, trees, flowers, toast, is in fact a virtual representation of what is real, suspended in the neural pathways of our minds. Our brains gather data via our senses and transduce them into information, and the information is what we actually perceive and interact with. As Korzybski famously said, the map is not the territory. So, what if we're looking at the universe inside out? Would we know? If consciousness is an inextricable part of our experienced reality, could it be something fundamental to reality? A first principle of existence instead of a subset of it? Whence comes this inner cinema we all experience? Does it arise epiphenomenally from the irritation of nervous tissue? Or is consciousness something more fundamental? Science has made great strides in understanding aspects of neurological function and in mapping out the brain's infrastructure, but in essence we still don't quite know what consciousness is. In the prevailing physicalist view of nature, which should not be conflated with the scientific view, mind is seen to be a mere chemical reaction. The problem with this explanation, of course, is that it isn't very satisfying. Looking at Wikipedia again, it says, the hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining how and why we have qualia or phenomenal experiences, how sensations acquire characteristics such as colors and tastes. David Chalmers, who introduced the term hard problem of consciousness, contrasts this with the easy problems of explaining the ability to discriminate, integrate information, report mental states, focus attention, etc. Easy problems are easy because all that is required for their solution is to specify a mechanism that can perform the function. That is, their proposed solutions, regardless of how complex or poorly understood they may be, can be entirely consistent with the modern materialistic conception of natural phenomenon. Chalmers claims that the problem of experience is distinct from this set, and he argues that the problem of experience will persist even when the performance of all the relevant functions is explained. Chalmers himself explains further, it is undeniable that some organisms are subjects of experience, but the question of how it is that these systems are subjects of experience is perplexing. Why is it that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, we have visual or auditory experience? The quality of deep blue, the sensation of middle sea. How can we explain why there is something it is like to entertain a mental image or to experience an emotion? It is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. Carl Jung, the great psychiatrist, stated a version of the problem of consciousness as follows. He said, the assumption of a causal relation between psyche and physis leads to conclusions which are difficult to square with experience. Either there are physical processes which cause psychic happenings, or there is a pre-existent psyche which organizes matter. In the first case, it is hard to see how chemical processes could ever produce psychic processes. And in the second case, one wonders how an immaterial psyche could ever set matter in motion. Now, the physicist Max Planck, the founder of quantum theory, was once quoted as saying, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. Okay, it's my opinion that Max Planck was making a pretty astute observation in this regard. Consciousness is a tricky business to explain, just as nobody has been inside an empty room. We can't get behind consciousness any more than we can see the back of our own head. Every observation ever made, every measurement ever taken, every thought ever thought has included consciousness as part of its process. It's seemingly meaningless for us to talk about the universe and the things in it as though it was somehow independent from the consciousness observing it. Physicist James Jeans, when asked the question, do you believe that life on this planet is the result of some sort of accident, or do you believe it is part of some great scheme? He replied, I incline to the idealistic theory that consciousness is fundamental, and that the material universe is derivative from consciousness, not consciousness from the material universe. In general, the universe seems to me to be nearer a great thought than to a great machine. It may well be, it seems to me, that each individual consciousness ought to be compared to a brain cell in a universal mind. So there you go. You ask a stupid question and you get, addressing the British Association in 1934, James Jeans went further and stated, what remains is in any case very different from the full-blooded matter and the forbidding materialism of the Victorian scientist. His objective in material universe is proved to consist of little more than constructs of our own minds. To this extent, then, modern physics has moved in the direction of philosophic idealism. Mind and matter, if not proved to be of similar nature, are at least found to be ingredients of one single system. There is no longer room for the kind of dualism which has haunted philosophy since the days of Descartes. Now, I have every intention of covering the topic of synchronicity in some detail at some future date. But for now, I just want to note that Carl Jung, formulating his theory of synchronicity in conjunction with physicist Wolfgang Pauli, made a very similar case for matter and psyche being part of some common substrate. So, now, previously I mentioned Donald Hoffman. Well, we read an article about him. The professor of cognitive psychology at the University of California. He is a proponent of what he calls conscious realism. And this is where I think we really get into the meat of what Hoffman is all about. They just kind of glossed this over in the Scientific American article. But Hoffman has published at least 2 peer-reviewed papers where he has proposed that consciousness, rather than being a byproduct of brain function, is a fundamental property of the universe. He describes his theory thus. He says, conscious realism is a non-physicalist monism. What exists in the objective world, independent of my perceptions, is a world of conscious agents, not a world of unconscious particles and fields. Those particles and fields, are icons in the MUIs of conscious agents, but are not themselves fundamental denizens of the objective world. Consciousness is fundamental. It is not a latecomer to the evolutionary history of the universe, arising from complex interactions of unconscious matter and fields. Consciousness is first. Matter and fields depend on it for their very existence. So the terms matter and consciousness function differently for the conscious realist than they do for the physicalist. For the physicalist, matter and other physical properties are ontologically fundamental. Consciousness is derivative arising from or identified with complex interactions of matter. For the conscious realist, consciousness is ontologically fundamental. Matter is derivative and among the symbols constructed by conscious agents. In a more recent paper, he writes, "Similarly, to construct a theory of consciousness, we propose a simple but rigorous formalism, called a conscious agent, consisting of 6 components. We then state the conscious agent thesis, which claims that every property of consciousness can be represented by some property of a conscious agent or system of interacting conscious agents. The hope is to start with a small and simple set of definitions and assumptions, and then to have a complete theory of consciousness arise as a series of theorems and proofs, or simulations when complexity precludes proof. We want a theory of consciousness qua consciousness, i.e. of consciousness on its own terms, not as something derivative or emergent from a prior physical world." Whew. You know, the profundity of what is being supposed here staggers me a little bit. Could these gentlemen, Planck, Jeans, Young, Hoffman, really be onto something? Have we been looking at the universe inside out? Is consciousness in fact the first principle of existence? Well, it strikes me as a really revolutionary idea. I would say it seems to be like a profoundly religious idea worth exploring. Seems to be a hell of an idea to explore scientifically. More to the point, it seems like an idea that could kind of bridge the gap between what we call religion and what we call science. And, a new view of the world and everything in it could kind of come from there. How do we explore this idea scientifically? Well, I have a few thoughts on that, but I'd like to play a clip of Donald Hoffman explaining his theory in a little more detail, and possibly in a slightly less stilted fashion than I have been doing. So here's Donald Hoffman speaking about his theory of consciousness. Let's have a listen.
So when I actually go give talks at universities and conferences, I present the mathematical model, and that raises the level of the conversation. If I didn't have that, I'm sure I would be dismissed without further ado. But with the mathematics, then they have to take it quite seriously. So my burden then is different from the burden of the neuroscientists who say that brain causes consciousness. They have to show how the brain or activities of the brain or properties of neurons or loops of activity cause consciousness without a hand wave, and they can't do that. My burden is to start with consciousness and without any hand waves get first all of physics. So I need to get classical relativity theory, I need to get quantum theory, and I need to get relativistic quantum theory as a starting point, and then hopefully an understanding of how neurobiology arises out of it. So for me, what I have to do is first say what I mean by consciousness. So I have to have a mathematical model. And I've presented one at this conference that I call conscious agent. And it's a very simple, and for a mathematician, my structure is actually quite simple. It's just 3 probability spaces, 3 maps between those spaces, technically Markovian kernels, and then just 1 counter that counts the number of experiences that you've had. It's a very, very simple mathematical structure. So I propose that captures that plus then all the combinatorics, right, that you can get by interacting different conscious agents together, gives me a complete model for consciousness. So it's an empirical claim, and the claim is what I call the conscious agent thesis, that every aspect of consciousness can be represented as some system of interacting conscious agents. That's the claim. Very, very precise claim. and I present it in the same manner as Church-Turing thesis in the field of computation, where Turing came up with a model that's an abstract model of computation that's about as simple as my model. It's different, but it's he had, I think it's a 6 or 7 tuple Turing machine that he defined. I have a 7 tuple conscious agent that I've defined. And then Turing said that this simple 7 tuple that he defined, the Turing machine, is capable of representing any effective procedure, period. Anything that any computer could do could be done by his Turing machine. That's the Church-Turing thesis. If he's right, then the Turing machine provides this simple formalism which is universal for all computation. And theorems then can be built on that because it's so simple. So we get the halting problem and busy beaver problem, all these things that are actually solved because of Turing's thesis. So we get computer science as a science and not just hacking because of this thesis. So I present my thesis, the conscious agent thesis, in the same spirit. Here's a fundamental definition of conscious agent. The claim is that every aspect of consciousness, every aspect, can be represented by a single conscious agent or conscious agents in connection, in interaction. And so it's an empirical thesis in the same sense as Turing's. It can be falsified. If someone can find some feature of consciousness that they show cannot be modeled by this formalism, I'm wrong. And I have to either abandon the project or change my formalism. I'll probably try to change the formalism first. But so then the other thing I have is what I call the thesis of conscious realism, which says that the world consists only of conscious agents. So I have one definition of conscious agent and one thesis, namely that the world consists only of conscious agents. And from that, so one definition and one postulate, I'm hoping by theorem and proof to get all of quantum physics and a complete model of consciousness. So to solve the mind-body problem in that way, without any hand wave, as pure mathematical consequences of the basic definition and postulate. So theorem, proof, all the way through. And what I presented in the talk this morning was I am able to show that the asymptotic behavior of conscious agents in interaction gives us precisely the same equations. The equations that describe that are mathematically precisely the same equations at one level that describe the wave equation of the quantum free particle. I'm able to put them in precise correspondence so I can read off how physical variables like position, time, energy, momentum are related to precise variables of the asymptotic behavior of conscious agents. So the claim is that particles in physics are our representation of asymptotic dynamics of consciousness. So it's the long-term, asymptotics means long-term. The long-term dynamics of consciousness is what we represent by these simple things, particles. That's the correspondence. So that's a precise mathematical claim. And that's the nice thing about having a mathematical formalism. These claims are extremely precise, and so they're extremely falsifiable.
I've heard a lot of theories being put forward by very smart people who are trying to figure out what the basic stuff of nature is. Hoffman posits consciousness as the fundamental building block of the universe. Pythagoras thought the world was made out of triangles. Plato seemed to think that the world was made of ideas. I've heard it said that maybe motion is the basic stuff of existence, that everything is just built up from vibrations of some sort of substrate. Well, maybe all these theses are saying the same thing different ways. We are in the peculiar habit of trying to describe the universe as a thing apart from ourselves, which on the face of it seems a tad futile. Nobody's ever been in an empty room. There's never been an observation of an unconscious cosmos. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. Is mathematics created by us in our attempt to map the territory around us, or is it discovered as we observe our surroundings? From a holistic perspective, That is generally that the properties of a given system can't be wholly determined or explained by its component parts alone, but the system as a whole determines in an important way how the parts behave. From a holistic perspective, couldn't it be said that life is a manifestation of cosmic law, made from stardust, emerging like a wave in a torrent of sunshine from the waters of this planet to make mathematics and music? Are we, in fact, the cosmos' way of producing mathematics? Or are we the cosmos' way of producing chairs and plastic bags? Alan Watts would probably say, well, who is it that's asking the question anyways? You are something the whole universe is doing, in the same way that a wave is something the whole ocean is doing. Aleister Crowley notes that consciousness arises from protoplasm, whose existence depends on innumerable physical conditions peculiar to our world, which depend in turn on innumerable universal laws and constants, on the arrangement and balance of, quote, the whole universe of matter. We may say, then, says Crowley, that our consciousness is connected with the remotest galaxies, yet we do not even know how it arises from or with the molecular changes in the brain. Carl Sagan simply states, the cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself. Well, if this is the case, perhaps it's academic whether mathematics is discovered or invented. Maybe it's both, simultaneously. Getting back to firmer ground for a moment, though, is it possible for us to scientifically test the theory that consciousness is somehow a fundamental building block of reality? Well, we can't really prove it. But what we can do is conduct an experiment that falsifies the physicalist assertion that consciousness is just a trick of the protoplasm encased in our skulls. This gets into territory that deserves its own show to cover properly. But consider, for example, the work of Dr. Michael Persinger, a cognitive neuroscience researcher with over 200 peer-reviewed publications to his credit. Persinger invented the so-called God helmet, which applied rotating magnetic fields to subjects' brains in order to provoke in them a sense of otherness or divine presence. He was the darling of bonehead pseudo-skeptics everywhere, who delighted in the notion that God could be proven to be a mere byproduct of neural misfires, and therefore atheism reigned supreme and the universe was clearly just a bunch of molecules. Ironic, then, that Persinger has gone on to publish reports of rudimentary telepathic communication between pairs of subjects in his laboratory, and research on remote viewing experiments involving the purported remote viewing expert Ingo Swann. Yes, you heard that right. Telepathy. Evidence 4. In a lab. Why hasn't this discovery rocked the world? Why hasn't it shaken the foundations of science to its core? How is it that most of us have never even heard of this man, Michael Persinger? This must be a joke, right? Well, it remains a secret for more or less the same reasons that the JFK assassination remains a taboo topic in journalistic circles, despite it being glaringly obvious to even an idiot that there was a conspiracy involved. It's not on television or in the newspapers, so it didn't happen. Cognitive dissonance takes care of the rest. As Ian Stevenson once said about his work, the wish not to believe can influence as strongly as the wish to believe. Confronting your average atheistic scientism advocate with evidence of telepathy is akin to confronting a fundamentalist Baptist pastor with evidence of his own homosexuality. They're just not going to listen. There's more to this story, and there are other stories like it. As I said, the topic of science and the paranormal merits its own show or shows, but it's enough for now to take note that there are experiments being done that can falsify the physicalist viewpoint and pave the way for theories like Hoffman's to be taken seriously. On that note, I had one other article I wanted to share, titled Consciousness After Clinical Death, the Biggest Ever Scientific Study Published. It comes to us via the Bioethics Research Library of Georgetown University, and it reads as follows. Southampton University scientists have found evidence that awareness continues for at least several minutes after clinical death, which was previously thought impossible. A recent article in British newspaper The Daily Mail featured an interview with Dr. Sam Parnia, with the lead, Consciousness may continue even after death, scientists now believe. Sam Parnia is head of a multidisciplinary team at Southampton University who published a study in the Official Journal of European Resuscitation Council with the title Awareness During Resuscitation, a Prospective Study, which included more than 2,000 persons who suffered a cardiac arrest and successfully responded to resuscitation treatment in 15 hospitals in the United States, United Kingdom, and Austria. This is the largest study of its kind to date, using rigorous methodology in order to exclude all those cases that could be based on individual impressions that are worthy but which hold no scientific interest. Jerry Nolan, editor-in-chief at Resuscitation Journal, who did not participate in the study but is considered an authority on the subject, said of the research, Dr. Parnia and his colleagues are to be congratulated on the completion of a fascinating study that will open the door to more extensive research into what happens when we die. Consciousness after clinical death? Whether it fades away afterwards, we do not know. The results revealed that 40% of those who survived a cardiac arrest were aware during the time that they were clinically dead and before their hearts were restarted. Dr. Parnia, in the interview, stated, "The evidence thus far suggests that in the first few minutes after death, consciousness is not annihilated. Whether it fades away afterwards, we do not know, but right after death, consciousness is not lost. We know the brain can't function when the heart has stopped beating, but in this case, conscious awareness appears to have continued for up to 3 minutes into the period when the heart wasn't beating, even though the brain typically shuts down within 20 to 30 seconds after the heart has stopped. This is significant since it has often been assumed that experiences in relation to death are likely hallucinations or illusions occurring either before the heart stops or after the heart has been successfully restarted, but not an experience corresponding with real events when the heart isn't beating. Furthermore, the detailed recollections of visual awareness in the case were consistent with verified events." The study director continued, saying that a total of 2,060 cardiac arrest patients were studied. Of that number, 330 survived, and 140 said that they had been partly aware at the time of resuscitating. Of these latter, states Parnia, 39% described a perception of awareness but did not have any explicit memory of events, which suggests, according to Dr. Parnia, that more people may have mental activity initially but then lose their memories, either due to the effects of brain injury or sedative drugs on memory recall. He continued, saying, 1 in 5 said they had felt an unusual sense of peacefulness, while nearly 1/3 said time had slowed down or sped up. Some recalled seeing a bright light, a golden flash, or the sun shining. Others recounted feelings of fear or drowning or being dragged through deep water. 13% said they had felt separated from their bodies, and the same number said their senses had been heightened. Parnia believes that contrary to perception, death is not a specific moment, but a potentially reversible process that occurs after any severe illness or accident causes the lungs, heart, and brain to cease functioning. The study director said, "In this study we wanted to go beyond the emotionally charged yet poorly defined term of near-death experiences, to explore objectively what happens when we die. While it was not possible to absolutely prove the reality or meaning of patients' experiences and claims of awareness, due to the very low incidence, 2% of explicit recall of visual awareness or so-called out-of-body experiences, but it was impossible to disclaim them either, and more work is needed in this area. Finally, we cite the opinion of David Wild, a psychologist at Nottingham Trent University, who is currently compiling data on out-of-body experiences in an attempt to define a pattern which links each episode. He says, most studies look retrospectively, 10 or 20 years ago, but the researchers went out looking for examples and used a really large sample size, so this gives the work a lot of validity. There is some very good evidence here that these experiences are actually happening after people have medically died. We just don't know what is going on. We are still very much in the dark about what happens when you die, and hopefully this study will help shine a scientific lens onto that. In our opinion, this is still the article. In our opinion, the study led by Parnia merits special attention because of its scientific rigor and the prudence of its conclusions, which are supported by scientifically proven facts. We hope that this study can also be extended to those who have been diagnosed as brain dead and have come back to life." So, I'm left wondering, will someone like Sam Parnia prove to be making a colossal mistake, or is he a 21st century Galileo trying to convince people who are just blinded by their own ignorance to look through a telescope? Time will tell, I hope. But the subject matter has the potential to overturn the entire order of how we view ourselves and our place in the world. Imagine how different the world would be without fear of death. Imagine a world where religious claims became the purview of science, and scientific claims gave people the comfort of religion. Imagine a world where human potential was being realized because we saw ourselves and each other as more than sallow, resource-consuming meatbags on a one-way trip to an ignoble grave on a doomed planet. We might even forget our place in the current order of things. I doubt the powers that be would be too pleased with that. I think we're talking revolutionary talk here. I think I'd better wrap it up for the night with that thought. I very much hope we'll have another chance to get together and discuss some of these things further. For now, I hope I've managed to direct your attention towards information that has given you a larger view of what's possible. From Ottawa, Ontario, this has been Project Poseidon's Channel Aquarius. I'm Dave the Dude, and I'm ready for bed. So, good night, and happy dreaming. I'll hope to see you on the flip side.
I'm an alligator. I'm a mama, papa coming for you. I'm the space invader. I'll be a rock and rollin' bitch for you. Keep your mouth shut. Smoking like a big monkey bird. And I'm busting up a brain for the world. your holy